Alright, so a couple of people have asked how we would go about replacing the basic cube with our own character, which is a very good question. It's not essential that we do this at all, but it would be something that's would be quite nice to have if there's time later on. Really, it's not a big job, but it's a little bit challenging because it can get a little bit messy. But I'm sure you guys are up to the challenge. So the problem is obviously that in the previous kind of iteration of this, it didn't really matter that the what direction the cube is facing. The cube is a cube, but if we introduce our own characters to this, they're likely to have a front and a back. And unless your character is a crab, this is probably not the appropriate motion for your character. So we've got a couple of things that we need to do to resolve this. Let's have a look at the steps we're going to take just very quickly. So we're going to be rotating the character to match the direction that he is travelling in. We've got our generic white dude over here. This is the question that he has posed. So to do this, we've got a couple of steps. Actually, there's a step before this. I suppose that would be A, which is that we're going to use the local coordinates of our character rather than global. So that's one thing that we've got to change. So we're going to change the global coordinates that we were using previously in the simple motion actuator. We're going to use the local coordinates, and what we've got to do is Blender's got to keep a hold of which direction the character is actually travelling in. We have 4 different permutations of motion. So we've got our positive y, we've got negative y, we've got positive x, and we've got a negative x. So we've got 4 different directions of travel. So what we've got to do is we're going to create a property. Property, by the way, is just another name for a variable. You may have heard of this if you're doing computer science, or if you're interested in programming. A variable or a property is a kind of chunk of data that we use to store values. We use it to store information that we can then call upon later. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to create a property to store which direction it's going to be going in, which direction it's travelling in. And we're going to store that as a number. So if it's positive on the y, it's going to be 0, negative 1, positive x is going to be 2, and 3. So it's going to be one of 4 numbers, and then we're going to call up, use that data to call up a particular action, a particular keyframe, in an action. So we've used actions briefly when you created your button, if you've got that far. So we're going to use an action which is like in a little chunk of animation with 4 keyframes in it, and we're going to compare the number that the variable, the property, is holding and play a corresponding frame in that action. So to do that, we'll be using the dope sheet, which is a kind of animation tool that Blender has, one of many, and we're going to be using a particular mode of that dope sheet called the action editor. So let's get stuck into that. Right, this is the one I'm going to be using, I think. I suppose I could show you very quickly what it's going to look like at the end. This one here, they won't take too long to load. So here we've got this little tank guy. It's just the easiest thing to model from that basic cube, and it's now facing the appropriate direction. Okay, so let's get rid of that and go back to the demo version that doesn't have any of the functionality yet. So we've got to start off by creating that property I mentioned. So we're going to create a property. I think we'll just stick with the character. Sorry, excuse me. If we go back to my notes, the first thing we've got to do is change the global coordinates that we're using for the motion in each of these motion actuators on our character. Change these from global to local. So it's global if it's grey, it's local if it's white. So it's going to be using the global coordinates. And you'll notice that in the 3D view here it's set to local also. All this means is, you can see these are the global coordinates. You know, and if we're using global coordinates, it doesn't matter what way we rotate this, y is always going to be pointing this direction. With local coordinates, if I rotate this on the z-axis around here, y is going to point, you know, the coordinates now follow which direction the character's pointing. So we've changed that, we've changed our global coordinates to local coordinates. Now we'll make that property. So into our game properties, add a game property called direction. We're not going to use a float, these should be integers really. Float is just a number that has decimal places, and integer is a whole number. It's just a bit more straightforward. I'm going to click the I button here just to make sure the show debug properties is checked, so that we can keep track of this property. Let's assign that property a value depending on what key we are pressing. So actuators, we're going to have to add 4 of these, so bear with me. So we're going to assign direction a value of 0 when we press the W key. This is my W key. Now really I should be minimizing this and moving it up in the stack just to keep this neat, but to save time I'm just going to stretch these across. So when it's W is pressed, it moves on 0.1 on the y-axis and sets this property to 0. So let's do that again quickly a couple more times. Direction, set it to 1. When we press the S key, this is my S key, and I'm just going to hit, actually what I'll do is not move anything to another layer. I'll start the screencast keys so you can see what keys I'm pressing. I'm going to hit shift space, it's coming to full screen view on the logic editor, and let's add the rest of these properties in. So direction, now I've lost track, that was 1, this one's going to be 2. So when we press the A key, which is our left direction, it's going to set that to 2. One more, property, direction, 3. So 0, 1, 2, 3. And this is my D key, hopefully. Yes, so when you press D, it moves positive on the X and assigns direction to 3. Right, let's have a little look. So let's see if we are able to track that. So here we have direction equals 0. It's going to stay at 0 as I hit the W key. It's going to turn to 1 when I go backwards with the S key. When I go left, it's 2. When I go right, it's 3. So that's working fine. So next thing to do is to set up these keyframes that I was talking about. So select our character, and now we're going to switch from the logic editor and we're going to go into the dope sheet. So as I said, this is a kind of timeline editor for editing keyframes in animation, and we're going to use, because the game engine uses actions, it likes to call up an action which is just a little chunk of animation. We switch to the action editor, we're going to create a new action and we're going to call it direction. And the playhead, this green line here is the playhead. We're going to make sure that's in frame 0, and we're going to keyframe this character in this position in frame 0. So we're going to hit I in the 3D view and choose rotation. So I to insert keyframe. In Blender we can keyframe all sorts of values. We can keyframe color values and lights, etc. But on objects we can keyframe the location, the rotation and the scale, or combinations of that. We just really want to keyframe its rotation. So I and then select rotation. You can see we now have a keyframe here for rotation in frame 0. So I'm going to hit the right arrow once to move to frame 1, and I'm going to hit R, Z, 180 so that it faces the opposite direction in frame 1, and then I keyframe that rotation into the timeline, right arrow to move it 1 frame, and now we're going to do R, Z, I think it should be -90, yep, so we want it to face that direction in frame 3, keyframe that, I, and rotation. And our last frame is going to be 180 degrees again on the z-axis, R, Z, 180, and I, and rotation. So when it's 0, it's facing that way. When we press S, it's going to face this way, A, D. So we'll come out of our dope sheet and back to the logic editor. And we've got to call up that action and play a particular frame depending on what that property is. So if that property is 0, if the property direction is equal to 0, play frame 0 of that action. So let's do the full screen again. So play our action direction, start in frame 0 and end in frame 0. Can I just link this straight across? Yeah. Okay, so it's not playing any animation, it's just playing frame 0 and ending in frame 0. So it faces the correct direction. Okay, so we'll just minimize these. Again, we've got to do this 4 times obviously. So if direction is equal to 1, play that action, direction, and play frame 1. And end in frame 1. If the property is 2, play frame 2. I think you get the idea now. Let's hope it works. And then one more. If the property direction is equal to 3, play frame 3. Oops, not 0.3. Action, direction, play frame 3. Right. Okay. Shift space to come out of full screen mode, and then we are going to cross our fingers, head back to layer 1. I'm pretty sure that's all there is to it. So W, S, A, and D. So I hope that that makes sense. One thing to note, I suppose, is that the variable is set to 0 by default, so that's quite handy. The direction property is set to 0 when it starts. So when it fires in, when it drops in, when it lands, it's already at 0, so it's facing the right direction. W just kind of confirms that. S changes the property to 1. Because the property is 1, it plays frame 1, etc. I did have these kind of noted down in Photoshop, so if it's any help to you, you should really have your directions coordinated with these keys really, and then these properties, and it should all work fine. Okay, good luck with that. I hope it helps.